He told them that she had run off.
He looks over and he sees a skull on the ground. Nothing really adds up.
A knock breaks the quiet. A man opens the door, a small child balanced on his hip. His voice is steady, almost practiced. He tells the officers his wife is gone. He says she ran off, says she's done it before, says everything is fine, but the child in his arms doesn't look like a child who's been left behind before. Inside the house, nothing appears rushed. No signs of a struggle, no panic in his tone, just a story offered quickly, as if he's relieved to finally say it out loud. The officers leave, but the words don't sit right. Mothers don't disappear like this. Not without a call, not without a plan, not without their child. So one question lingers longer than it should. Who walks away from their life and leaves everything behind? Especially when, hours later, her car turns up in a place she was never supposed to be. Unlocked, silent, waiting. If you're enjoying true crime stories told with care and depth, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world, because cases like this don't only happen in places we expect. They happen where people feel safe. Back at the scene, detectives circle the vehicle. Something feels off. Too clean. Too wrong. The seat is positioned in a way that doesn't match the woman who owned it. The items you'd expect a mother to keep close aren't there. And in that moment, standing beside a car that shouldn't be empty, investigators realize something chilling. She may not have gone anywhere on her own. Arlington, Texas sits between two major cities, a place many families choose because life there feels predictable. Streets are familiar, neighbors recognize each other's routines. Serious crime exists, but it rarely defines the community. That sense of normalcy is exactly why the call that came in that Wednesday night stood out. It wasn't a frantic 911 call. It was concern, quiet, persistent concern. Friends of a woman named Emilita Reeves contacted police because something felt wrong. They hadn't seen her, they hadn't heard her voice, and for hours, then an entire day, every attempt to reach her had failed. The last confirmed contact anyone had with Emilita was earlier that morning, October 11th. That alone might not have raised alarms. Adults miss calls, phones die, plans change. But Emilita wasn't known for disappearing without explanation. She checked in, she followed routines, and most importantly, she never went long without contact with the people closest to her. As the day turned into night, worry hardened into fear. Officers were dispatched to the Reeves residence for a welfare check. When they arrived and knocked, the door opened to Jack Reeves. He was holding their young child. He listened as officers explained why they were there. Then he gave his explanation quickly, almost defensively. Emilita was gone, he said. She had run off with a lover. According to him, this wasn't unusual behavior. He insisted she had done this before. Everything, he claimed, was under control. But the officers noticed how uneasy he was. The answers came too fast. The story felt rehearsed, and the presence of the child, quiet, carried close, only made the explanation harder to accept. Police left the residence, but the case didn't close there. Because back with Emilita's friends, the panic didn't ease. If this was something she did all the time, why had no one ever seen it before? Why had she left without a single word to the people she trusted most? And why would a mother vanish without making arrangements for her child? Those questions followed detectives into the next phase of the case, because if Emilita really had walked away willingly, none of this reaction made sense. To understand why her disappearance alarmed so many people, detectives first had to understand who Emilita Reeves was before she ever arrived in Texas. Emilita grew up in the Philippines, in circumstances that offered few opportunities and constant responsibility. Like many women in her position, she carried the weight of her family's future on her shoulders. When she met Jack Reeves, the arrangement was presented as a way forward, a marriage that promised stability, financial support, and a chance to build a different life. She agreed, not because of romance, but because it offered security for the people she loved most. When Emilita moved to Arlington, the reality was far more isolating than she expected. She was far from home, far from familiar language, food, and customs. Jack controlled the environment around her. He worked, he knew the area, he understood how things functioned. Emilita, meanwhile, depended heavily on the small circle of friends she slowly built within the local Filipino and Asian community. Those friendships became her lifeline. Her friends described her as gentle, attentive, and deeply devoted to her child. Motherhood defined her daily choices. Everything she did revolved around her son. His safety, his routine, his comfort. That was the detail investigators kept hearing over and over again. No matter what was happening in her marriage, Emilita would not leave without him. Not for a night, not for a few hours, not for anyone. As time went on, Emilita began confiding more in the people she trusted. She spoke about feeling alone inside her own home. She talked about being unhappy, about feeling trapped in a life she hadn't fully chosen. But even then, she stayed. She stayed because she believed enduring discomfort was better than risking her child's future. One of her closest friends later described the change in a way that stuck with investigators. She said Emilita used to call constantly, short check-ins, long conversations, late-night talks when things felt heavy. Then suddenly, the phone went quiet. Messages went unanswered. Calls went straight to nothing. The silence wasn't just unusual, it felt wrong. That perspective mattered. Because from the outside, Emilita's life may have looked stable, married, housed, cared for. But from the inside, she was balancing fear, obligation, and the fierce instinct to protect her child at all costs. And there was something else. In those private conversations with friends, Emilita had shared things she didn't want her husband to know. Details about her marriage, fears she kept hidden, choices she was considering but hadn't yet acted on. Those secrets, spoken quietly to the people she trusted, would soon become critical. Because once detectives began listening closely to Emilita's story, they realized her disappearance wasn't just about a missing woman. It was about what she knew, and what might have happened if the wrong person found out. As detectives dug deeper into Emilita's personal life, one name surfaced again and again: Mona Lisa. She wasn't just a friend, she was the person Emilita spoke to every day. Long calls, frequent check-ins, conversations that filled the emotional gaps left by a strained marriage. When Emilita stopped responding, Mona Lisa knew something was seriously wrong. Mona Lisa was the one who first contacted police. And when detectives sat down with her, they realized she knew more about Emilita's marriage than anyone else. Not rumors, not assumptions, real conversations that had taken place over months. Through those conversations, investigators learned the truth behind Emilita's marriage to Jack Reeves. It was not a love story. Jack had met Emilita through a publication called Cherry Blossoms, a mail-order bride service connecting American men with women overseas. For Emilita, agreeing to the marriage wasn't about romance. It was about survival. She wanted stability. She wanted to help her family back home, and she believed this was the only path available to her. Once she arrived in Texas, that arrangement became heavier than she expected. She lived under Jack's roof in his world, on his terms. Her independence was limited. Her circle was small, and the marriage offered little emotional safety. Over time, Emilita confided in Mona Lisa about how lonely she felt and how unhappy she had become. Eventually, that emotional closeness turned into something more. Mona Lisa admitted to investigators that she and Emilita had developed a romantic relationship. It wasn't impulsive. It grew out of isolation, trust, and the need to feel understood. Emilita wasn't reckless. She was searching for comfort in a situation where she felt increasingly trapped. For detectives, this information mattered. Whenever relationships overlap, questions follow. Motives are examined. Timelines are scrutinized. Everyone becomes part of the picture. But Mona Lisa didn't avoid the scrutiny. She cooperated fully. She provided phone records. She accounted for her whereabouts. And critically, she was not present during the window of time when Emilita disappeared. Her concern came across as genuine, not defensive. Investigators also noticed how consistent her statements were. She repeated the same details without contradiction. Details that others in Emilita's life echoed as well. On screen, key observations were noted clearly. She would never leave her child. She always locked her car. Those weren't emotional reactions. They were patterns, habits, behaviors Emilita never broke. By the end of the interviews, detectives no longer viewed Mona Lisa as a suspect. She was a witness, one of the few people who truly knew what Emilita's life looked like behind closed doors. But before they could fully rule anything out, another detail emerged from those conversations. A separate connection. A planned meeting. A name that hadn't yet been explored. And once that name entered the investigation, the timeline around Emilita's disappearance grew much tighter. Because now, detectives weren't just asking what happened inside the marriage. They were asking who Emilita was supposed to meet, and why she never made it there. The next lead came quietly, almost casually, but it shifted the direction of the case. During follow-up interviews, detectives learned that Emilita had plans the night she disappeared. She wasn't supposed to be home. She was supposed to meet someone. His name was Tony. Tony was known within the same community Emilita relied on. He wasn't a stranger pulled from nowhere. He was someone she had interacted with before, someone investigators needed to hear from directly. According to Emilita's friends, she had mentioned the meeting ahead of time. It wasn't secretive. It wasn't rushed. Just a plan, set like any other. When detectives tracked Tony down, he didn't hesitate to speak with them. He didn't avoid questions. He didn't ask for delays. From the beginning, he acknowledged knowing Emilita and confirmed that they were supposed to meet that evening. But his version of events stopped there. He said she never showed up. No phone call. No message. No explanation. He waited, assuming she was running late. When time passed and there was still nothing, he eventually left. According to Tony, that was the last moment he expected to hear her name connected to something far more serious. Detectives listened carefully. They checked times. They asked him to walk through his movements step by step, where he was earlier that evening, where he waited, when he left. His answers stayed consistent. There were no sudden changes, no corrections mid-sentence. He didn't distance himself from the situation, but he didn't insert himself either. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the coincidence. Emilita vanished on the same night she was supposed to meet Tony. In cases like this, timing matters. And coincidence only stretches so far before it has to be tested. They verified his location. They compared his timeline against what little information they had about Emilita's last known movements. Everything Tony described placed him away from the point where she would have disappeared. Nothing directly tied him to her vanishing. And yet, one detail refused to fade. Tony worked near the area where Emilita was supposed to be that night. Not far. Close enough to notice things most people wouldn't. Close enough that investigators had to ask whether he could have seen her without realizing it, or whether she had been redirected before she ever reached him. The pressure began to build. This was no longer a case of someone losing contact unexpectedly. Too many threads were now overlapping. A tense marriage, a planned meeting, conflicting explanations, and a growing sense that Emilita's routine had been interrupted deliberately. Detectives pressed Tony again. They were direct. They explained that he was now part of an active investigation. Instead of resisting, he agreed to do something few suspects volunteer for. He took a polygraph test. The results did not point toward deception. That should have eased the tension. But it didn't. Because just as detectives began to step back from Tony's involvement, another discovery was made. One that pulled the investigation sharply away from conversation and into physical evidence. Then police find something that changes everything. The call came in not long after Tony's interview, and it redirected every assumption detectives had been working with. Emilita's car had been located. It wasn't wrecked. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't ditched on the side of a highway. It was sitting in a parking lot, as if someone had simply parked it and walked away. No note, no explanation, just the vehicle, alone. Officers moved quickly to secure the area. At first glance, nothing screamed emergency, but closer inspection told a different story. The doors were unlocked. That detail mattered more than it might seem. Emilita was known for being careful. Friends described it as habit, not paranoia. She locked her car every time she stepped away from it, even if she was only gone for a minute. Yet here it sat, open, exposed, waiting. Then officers noticed what wasn't inside. Her child's car seat was gone. This wasn't something Emilita removed casually. She kept it in the car so she could move freely with her son whenever she needed to. Taking it out would have required intention, planning, a reason. But there was no sign her child had been with her that night, and no explanation for why the seat would be missing if she had driven the car herself. As investigators continued their examination, another detail pushed the situation from strange to deeply troubling. The driver's seat was positioned far back, not slightly adjusted, not marginally off. It was set for someone with a much larger frame. Emilita was small in stature. To reach the pedals, she always kept the seat close to the steering wheel. The position it was found in would have made it impossible for her to drive comfortably, if at all. That realization settled in slowly, then all at once. If Emilita didn't drive that car to the parking lot, who did? Officers stood around the vehicle, each detail adding weight. The unlocked doors, the missing car seat, the seat position that didn't match the woman who owned it. Individually, they were odd. Together, they formed a picture that could no longer be explained by someone choosing to leave. This wasn't carelessness. It looked staged. Detectives began reconstructing possibilities. If Emilita had been forced from the vehicle, why bring it here? Why not abandon it somewhere less visible? If she had met someone willingly, why would that person adjust the seat and remove the car seat? None of the answers fit cleanly. The location raised questions too. It wasn't a place Emilita regularly visited. It wasn't along a route she commonly took. It was close enough to familiar areas to blend in, yet distant enough to disconnect the car from her routine. That's when the case crossed a line. Up until this point, detectives were still working under the possibility that Emilita had chosen to disappear. People leave. Relationships collapse. New lives begin. But standing beside that car, it became increasingly difficult to believe this was voluntary. Because people who walk away don't leave behind contradictions. They don't leave cars that tell a different story than their habits. They don't remove child seats without their child. And they don't adjust the driver's seat for someone else. As investigators processed what they were seeing, the urgency shifted. This was no longer about locating a missing person. It was about determining when control had been taken away from her. And with that realization came a question no one wanted to ask out loud, but everyone was thinking. Was Emilita already gone before anyone even knew she was missing? The discovery of Emilita's abandoned car forced detectives to narrow their focus. With physical evidence now in play, every person connected to her final hours had to be reevaluated, starting with the most obvious outside connection. Tony. Investigators brought him back in, this time with a more direct approach. They laid out what they had found, the location of the car, the timing of her disappearance, the unanswered questions. Tony didn't push back. Instead, he agreed to take a polygraph examination. The results did not indicate deception. For detectives, that mattered. Polygraphs are not perfect, but when combined with consistent statements and verified timelines, they help eliminate directions that lead nowhere. Tony's story remained unchanged. He repeated that Emilita never arrived. He expressed genuine confusion about how her car ended up where it did. And then, without being prompted, he offered something investigators hadn't heard before. He said Emilita had been afraid. According to Tony, Emilita had talked about problems at home. She had spoken about feeling unsafe, about wanting out of the marriage. And when he was asked who he believed could be responsible for her disappearance, Tony didn't hesitate. He said the person investigators needed to look at was Jack Reeves. That statement didn't come across as an attempt to shift blame. It aligned with what detectives were already beginning to suspect. Emilita had been planning changes. She had been confiding in others. And now, the car evidence suggested she hadn't acted freely. With Tony effectively cleared, the spotlight moved where it had been circling from the beginning, back to the house where Emilita was last seen and to the man who had answered the door holding their child. Detectives contacted Jack Reeves and asked him to come in for a formal interview. Unlike the brief encounter during the welfare check, this conversation would be recorded, detailed, and deliberate. Jack agreed. Before we go any further, pause here for a moment. If you were the detective on this case, who would have your full attention right now? The person she planned to meet? The husband who says she ran off? Or someone we haven't even talked about yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because from this point forward, what Jack Reeves chose to say, what he volunteered without being asked, would turn a missing person investigation into something far more complex. And once detectives started listening closely, they realized they weren't just dealing with one unexplained disappearance. They were about to uncover a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. When Jack Reeves arrived for the formal interview, detectives noticed something immediately. He wasn't guarded. He wasn't cautious. In fact, he talked freely, almost eagerly. He answered questions before they were fully formed, offering details that hadn't been requested. At first, it seemed like cooperation. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that Jack was filling the room with information detectives hadn't yet asked for. They began with Emilita. Jack repeated what he had told officers at the house. She was gone. He believed she had left him. He said she had been involved with other people and suggested that this explained her disappearance. He spoke calmly, with little emotion, as if recounting an inconvenience rather than the sudden absence of his wife. Then the conversation shifted. As part of routine background questioning, detectives asked about Jack's past marriages. That's when the interview took a turn no one expected. Jack mentioned his first wife, Sharon Reeves. He said they had married when he was young while he was serving in the military. According to him, their marriage ended tragically. Sharon, he claimed, had taken her own life. He described a gunshot wound to the chest. Then he added a detail that caught detectives' attention instantly. He said she had pulled the trigger with her toe. The room went quiet. It wasn't just the claim itself, but the way Jack presented it. He didn't hesitate. He didn't frame it as something uncertain or traumatic. He stated it plainly, as if it were an unquestionable fact. Detectives made notes but didn't interrupt him. Jack continued. He explained that after Sharon's death, he later married again while stationed overseas. His second wife was a young Asian woman named Mang, also known as Mayang. Jack said they had gone on a trip to Lake Whitney. According to his account, she was on a flotation device in the water while he stepped away briefly. At some point, she fell off and drowned. Detectives exchanged glances. 2 wives, 2 deaths, both explained as unfortunate incidents. Both described without visible grief. Jack spoke as if these events were disconnected chapters, not something that required deeper reflection. He didn't express fear that his current wife was missing. He didn't question whether something terrible had happened to Emilita. Instead, he focused on recounting his own history, layering explanation on top of explanation. For detectives, the tone of the interview mattered as much as the content. Jack wasn't defensive. He was expansive, and the more he talked, the more the picture shifted. Because now, this wasn't just about Emilita Reeves vanishing without explanation. It was about a man whose life included multiple women who had died under circumstances that relied entirely on his version of events. 3 women, 1 man, and the stories don't match the evidence. In that moment, detectives understood the scope of what they were facing had changed completely. They weren't just searching for a missing wife anymore. They were preparing to reopen deaths that had been accepted, filed away, and buried, both literally and figuratively, for years. And the answers, if they still existed, were going to come from places no one had looked before. The moment Jack Reeves left the interview room, detectives knew they could no longer accept the past at face value. Sharon Reeves's death had been recorded as a suicide decades earlier, based almost entirely on one thing: Jack's account of what happened. There had been no full autopsy, no detailed forensic review. At the time, his explanation had been taken as sufficient. Now, that explanation was being questioned for the first time. Back then, there was no specialized scene unit, no thorough reconstruction, no second opinions. A justice of the peace ruled the death a suicide, and the case was closed. The official record rested on a single narrative: that Sharon had placed a shotgun against her chest and pulled the trigger with her toe. There was only one photograph from the scene. When investigators finally examined it, the image raised immediate concerns. Sharon's body was positioned on the bed, lying back, while the shotgun stood upright between her legs. The alignment didn't make sense. If the weapon had been discharged the way Jack described, the physical outcome should have been very different. Gravity alone challenged the story. The medical examiner brought in to review the case approached it methodically. To him, death investigations were never about assumptions. They were about consistency, whether the physical evidence matched the explanation given. Every wound, every angle, every detail had meaning, and in Sharon's case, there was very little original evidence to work with. Still, detectives made a decision few cases ever reach. They chose to exhume Sharon's body. Jack Reeves was not informed. The goal wasn't accusation, it was clarity. When the casket was opened years later, expectations were low. After so much time underground, remains are often beyond examination. But Sharon's body was preserved in an unexpected way. She was not skeletal. Instead, her remains had a clay-like quality, partially mummified. It was enough. Enough to work with. Enough to ask questions that had never been asked. The focus turned immediately to the gunshot wound. The medical examiner studied the entry point carefully, looking for clues about distance and direction. With shotgun injuries, patterns matter. At close range, the wound behaves differently than it does from several feet away. Spread patterns, satellite damage, and internal pathways tell a story the body can't speak aloud. What emerged didn't align with suicide. The trajectory of the shot was wrong. It entered at an angle inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound to the chest. In cases like this, individuals typically aim straight toward vital organs. This wound traveled on a slanted path, suggesting the weapon was positioned in a way Sharon herself could not have managed. To test the toe trigger claim, investigators went further. They conducted a reconstruction using a woman with similar height, limb length, and build. A similar firearm was used. Measurements were taken carefully. Each movement was replicated under controlled conditions. Again and again, the same result emerged. It couldn't be done. The angle required to produce Sharon's wound made it physically impossible for her to pull the trigger the way Jack had described. Then there was the injury to her toe. Jack had pointed to it as proof. But the medical examiner saw something else. The cut didn't match the expected damage from pulling a trigger. Its shape and direction suggested it had not occurred during the act itself. More troubling, the fact that it had remained visible after so many years indicated it may have been inflicted after death. That changed everything. Back then, there had been no scene unit, no deep autopsy. Just a story. Now, science was rereading that story. And it wasn't saying the same thing. Piece by piece, the conclusion became unavoidable. Sharon Reeves did not take her own life. The evidence supported only one explanation. She had been killed. Once that determination was made, the case surrounding Emilita Reeves took on a darker tone. Because when detectives compared timelines, motives, and behavior, the pattern was impossible to ignore. And once Sharon's death shifted from suicide to homicide, the question surrounding Emilita was no longer whether she had left willingly. It was whether she had ever had the chance to leave at all. With Sharon Reeves's death now reclassified, detectives began laying the timelines side by side, not to force a theory, but to see whether the past and present shared the same shape. In Sharon's case, the sequence was clear. Her marriage to Jack had been unraveling. While he was stationed overseas, Sharon made a decision that changed everything. She fell in love with someone else and chose to end the marriage. Divorce papers were served. Jack returned home immediately. According to his own account, he wanted to talk things through. 2 weeks later, Sharon was dead. At the time, her death closed the story. No one looked deeper. No one questioned whether the timing meant something. Now, decades later, that timing mattered. Because Emilita's situation carried a striking resemblance. In the weeks before she disappeared, Emilita had confided in friends that she was planning to leave the marriage. She had spoken openly about divorce. More importantly, she told people she trusted that Jack had agreed to it. That detail stayed consistent across multiple conversations. Emilita believed she was nearing an exit, one that would allow her to protect her child and reclaim some control over her life. Then she vanished, not after a public argument, not after a dramatic confrontation, but quietly, without a word, without her child, without the habits that defined her daily behavior. Detectives didn't need to speculate to see the pattern. In both cases, the moment a wife moved toward separation, the outcome was final. One death, one disappearance. Both explained away at first. Both centered around the same man. No assumptions were added. No conclusions forced. The facts stood on their own. Sharon chose divorce. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Emilita planned divorce. Shortly after, she vanished. When two women try to leave the same man and both are removed from his life in the worst way, it stops being coincidence. For investigators, this wasn't about emotion or theory. It was about recognizing repetition. And once repetition is acknowledged, the question shifts. It's no longer what happened, it becomes why it happened again. And whether anyone could stop it before history repeated itself one more time. With Sharon's case reclassified and Emilita still missing, detectives turned their attention to the second death Jack Reeves had described so casually during his interview. The drowning of his wife Mang, also known as Mayang, had been treated as an accident for years. At the time, there had been no reason to question it. Now, every detail mattered. According to Jack, the incident occurred during a trip to Lake Whitney. He said Mang had been on a flotation device while he stepped away briefly. When he returned, she was no longer on it. The water, he explained, wasn't deep. Still, she drowned. On paper, the explanation sounded simple, but when investigators revisited the circumstances, cracks began to show. Mang was not comfortable around water. That detail came from her own family. Her sister recalled how Mom avoided swimming whenever possible. Even at the beach, she stayed close to shore. Being alone on a flotation device was not something she would have chosen willingly. Then there were the marks. When Mang's body was prepared at the funeral home, her sister noticed injuries that didn't align with a peaceful accident. Bruises, scratches. They weren't dramatic enough at the time to trigger an investigation, but they were enough to leave a lasting impression on someone who knew her well. From the sister's point of view, the memory never faded. She remembered standing there, looking at Mang, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. These weren't the kinds of marks she expected from slipping into water. They looked like signs of struggle, marks that suggested contact, not a fall. At the time, no one pushed further. The death had already been explained. Jack's account stood uncontested, and without pressure from authorities, the questions stayed quiet. Now detectives placed Mang's death alongside the others. A woman afraid of water dies in shallow conditions. Her husband is the only witness. Physical marks go unexplained. The incident is closed without deeper review. It didn't prove anything on its own, but it didn't sit right. Investigators didn't need speculation to feel the weight of repetition. 3 relationships, 3 outcomes, each one ending with Jack alive, and the woman gone. By now, detectives weren't asking whether something bad had happened once. They were asking how many times the same explanation had been accepted without challenge. And more importantly, how many answers had been missed because no one thought to look closer the first time. By this point in the investigation, detectives weren't just assembling facts. They were confronting a set of truths that reached beyond one case, one victim, or one suspect. Emilita's disappearance and the deaths connected to the same household revealed how easily silence can be created and how difficult it can be to break once it settles in. One theme stood out clearly: isolation. Emilita had been moved far from everything familiar: family, culture, and support. Her world became smaller, controlled by geography and circumstance. When a person's circle is reduced to a single household, the ability to ask for help quietly disappears. What made the difference here was that Emilita still reached outward. She built friendships, she spoke, she told people when something wasn't right. Without that, there may never have been a report at all. Another lesson came from the way earlier cases were handled. Sharon's death had rested on a single explanation. No autopsy, no reconstruction, no challenge. When one version of events is accepted without testing it against physical evidence, the truth can be buried alongside the paperwork. Years passed before science was allowed to speak, and when it finally did, it told a different story. This case also showed why community matters more than people realize. Emilita's friends didn't dismiss the silence. They didn't tell themselves she'd call back eventually. They trusted their instincts and reported what felt wrong. That insistence pushed the investigation forward, when it could have stalled in its earliest hours. And then there's forensics, the quiet counterweight to time. Bodies change, memories fade, stories evolve, but evidence, when preserved or revisited correctly, still carries answers. Sharon's case proved that even years later, the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. The takeaway isn't about fear, it's about attention. Patterns matter, sudden changes matter, silence matters. If someone stops behaving like themselves, Notice it. If a story doesn't align with habits, question it. If a loved one feels isolated, stay connected. Write things down, keep records, speak up, even when it feels uncomfortable. Because in cases like this, the difference between a mystery and an answer often comes down to whether someone said, "This doesn't feel right," and refused to let that feeling go. And sometimes, that insistence is the only voice a victim ever gets. By the end of the investigation, detectives were left carrying a weight that couldn't be filed away neatly. Some answers had emerged clearly. Others remained just out of reach. The evidence spoke in fragments, but those fragments pointed in the same direction. A mother who never left without her child vanished without warning. Her car appeared in a place she didn't frequent, unlocked, altered, telling a story that didn't match her habits. The driver's seat suggested someone else had been behind the wheel. The absence of her child's car seat contradicted everything her friends knew about her priorities. Then there was the past that refused to stay buried. Sharon Reeves's death, once accepted as a suicide, could no longer be explained that way. The physical evidence, the wound angle, the failed reconstruction, the questionable injury to her toe, told a different story, one that had waited years to be heard. Placed beside Emilita's disappearance and Mang's unexplained drowning, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each woman entered Jack Reeves's life under different circumstances. Each woman was removed from it under explanations that depended entirely on his word. No single detail stood alone, but together they formed a shape that investigators couldn't unsee. What remained unanswered was the most painful part of all. Emilita herself. Where she went, when control was taken from her. Whether she knew what was coming. Those answers were never fully recovered. What can be said is this. Emilita was not careless. She was not distant. She was not someone who drifted away from her child or her friends. She was a woman trying to protect her son, trying to find a way out of a life that no longer felt safe. She deserved support. She deserved protection. She deserved to be heard. Instead, she was met with silence. Cases like this don't end when the camera stops rolling. They linger. They sit with the people who tried to speak up and with the investigators who saw the pattern too late to change the outcome. If this story stayed with you, share it. Because attention keeps cases from disappearing twice. And tell me in the comments what detail felt like the biggest red flag to you. The unlocked car, the seat position, or the toe trigger story. Because sometimes the smallest detail is the one that tells the loudest truth.